want to take a moment to welcome our presenters today. Jed Williamson was actually the chief investigator of this incident on Mount Hood in 1986. He's also investigated dozens of other similar mountaineering and outdoor education incidents over the years. You may know him as one of the founders of our accreditation program and the initial author of the accreditation manual for adventure education, or as the editor of Accidents and Incidents in North American Mountaineering, and a longtime friend of AEE. Done some other webinars with us as well. And also we have Lorca Smetana. Lorca was actually a student on this trip at the Oregon Episcopal School. Lorca is going to be able to share a very unique perspective on the experience of a tragedy like that and on the impact of something like that on the community, on an individual. She today works in the field of resilience, consulting with individuals and organizations. And we're really excited to hear both of your perspectives today. Lorca, if we could start with you just giving us a little bit of a sense of the base camp program and sort of the school itself and the atmosphere surrounding this trip, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you. So I went away to boarding school at OES as a freshman. And so I was living in the dorms for 4 years there. And I came from an outdoor background. And so arriving at the school and having them have a base camp program where systemically each different grade had a different kind of interaction with the outdoors was something that I took a little for granted. I assumed that it was more common than apparently it was even in that era. There weren't actually that many schools doing things on this scale. So all of the freshmen did a 3-day hike in one of the local wilderness areas, camping and hiking. The sophomores all participated every year in a climb for Mount Hood, and there were actually other options you could do if you really didn't want to or couldn't do it, but that was the outdoor program there. And then the juniors did a trail building project where we were out staying at a camp and building trails and doing maintenance in the farm, and then the seniors had another trip. So as a freshman, I participated in the hike, and I want to say that this is a small school. There are 600 students from kindergarten through, from kindergarten through 12th grade. So this was a pretty tight community where we all knew each other a lot. The way that the sophomore program was set up was that you could choose to do some community service instead. So that was one option. Or if you were going to participate in the climb, the rule was that you would start the climb. That was the rule. And you were allowed to take a few steps up onto the glacier under the ski lift and turn around if that's what you wanted to do. And we had endurance, field practices before where we were going on hikes, and then we had snow skills days beforehand too. So we were going up on the mountain beforehand and doing practice with ice gear. And it is a technical climb, but it's also one that is very, very, very commonly attempted by non-experienced climbers. So the climb had been, the Mount Hood component had been in place for many years before I arrived there as a student, and without incident, and led by Fritter Tom. And so I just also want to say briefly about the advanced climbing team. Unlike most of the students, I came into the school with growing up in a climbing background. My father was an early mountaineer in big wall climbing in Yosemite and elsewhere. And so when I came to be a junior, I applied to join the climbing team, which was 8 students who we climbed a lot on weekends, like with any sport. And then part of being on the climbing team was being an unofficial companion / assistant on each of the Mount Hood climbs. So I had made 2 separate attempts on Mount Hood. One as a sophomore, which Furter called off, and then one which we tried again and got turned back by weather. And so when I went on this particular trip in '86, I was not a sophomore, but I was on the climb as one of the 3 climbing team members who were there that time. So, and as such, I want to say that Furter was a climber that I trusted and respected and felt very good climbing with, always. And he was one of a climber in my father's mold, traditional and careful. And so it always felt good being there and part of that.
Yeah, sounds like a great place to be.
It was, yeah.
Okay, well, I'll pick up a little bit and then we'll come back to Lorca. I'll start out with saying that the events of the several days which this tragedy occurred certainly achieved national news. And it so happened it was the same year that the shuttle Challenger blew up, where all 7 crew members, including one of our beloved teachers from New Hampshire, Christa McAuliffe, who was a high school social studies teacher, perished in that. And towards the end, I'll talk about the fact that 2 of the causes of these incidents were similar. I mean, there were several intermixed causes, but 2 key causes were very similar. So now the incident happens, it's being televised, the rescue is being televised. I get a call at home from a friend who says, "Are you watching the events unfold regarding the Oregon Episcopal School Mount Hood incident?" And I said, "No, but I will." I went into the watch TV and I brought my daughter, who was the same age, in with me. And it was a very difficult thing for us to watch. And it was about a week later, very short time after this, that the headmaster, the chair of the board, Cecil Drinkward, called me on the phone and said, "I've been given your name by Outward Bound, said that you would be a good person to lead the investigation of this accident." And I agreed to do that. And I was given leeway to bring on other people. So on the team were Dr. Cameron Bangs, who had actually been involved with the incident as an ER doc who specialized in hypothermia and knew a lot about frostbite. And Peter Lev, a climbing friend of mine, I've been on a couple of expeditions with, expert in avalanche work and weather forecasting, and one of the owners of Exum Mountain Guides. Andy Harvard, who was had been on several expeditions as well. I was on one expedition with him, and he was also a successful lawyer at that point, working for the Federal Reserve. And then we had Bruce Shaw, who was the head of the Marin Academy north of San Francisco. They had an outdoor program and it included winter activities. So it was a pretty well-rounded team, I thought. And we went out and began our investigation. Now let's look at the big picture. There's Mount Hood at 11,265 feet, I think. And down from that, another significant point is Crater Rock. And just down to the right of that is an area called the Hog's Back. And then the couloir that you see going down the snow chute actually goes all the way down and eventually joins the ski area where you will be seeing in a diagram. And then over on the right in the snowfield is where the 9 people wound up. And just quickly go to the next diagram. That'll give you a close-up of it. Crater Rock was not that snow-covered on that day, but you can get a sense of it there. The Silcox Hut is at the top of the Palmer Lift. The Palmer Lift, of course, is a chairlift, so it's like giant wands in the snow. So from the time you leave the Timberline Lodge and you go up to the Silcox Hut, not so much concerned about technical skills and leadership because you can find your way down quite easily. And a number of students, in fact, did turn back. They started at 3 in the morning. They arrived at 2, I think, and put on all their stuff and headed up the hill. And several of them turned back before the Silcox Hut. And then you turned back
Above Silcox Hut.
Above Silcox Hut. And so continuing on, we had Father Tom Goman, Ralph Summers, the technical leader, a teacher who was actually Dean of Students, who was not experienced but really wanted to be part of this, and 9 students total, I think it was. Although Molly Schuler made it 10 students. So they continue up, and the weather at this point is fine. It's not really terribly deteriorating, and it doesn't happen until they get quite high up, along about the Hog's Back. At that point, though, they've been out since 3 in the morning, and it's now 11 in the morning. And the normal turn back time on Mount Hood is between 11 and 1, depending on the conditions and also the configuration of the party. Father Tom's just made the decision to try to go on a little bit farther. But what was the last thing he said to you?
Yeah, so when we stopped briefly at Silcox Hut and then kept on going, and I was getting cramps, and they were not going away. So I kept trying to work through them, but they weren't going away. And there was one of the sophomores who wanted to turn around at that point. And so from where we were, not too far past the Silcox Hut, it was very easy to see the hut and where we were going back. So straight shot down. And so when I talked to Fritter Tom, he suggested that I be the one to accompany her down. And so we did that. But what he told me then at that point was, he said, we might not be far behind you. He said, we're going to keep on going a little farther, but there's not, but we might be turning around and we might see you a little bit after you get down.
Okay. And that's an important point. I'll bring up later why that's important. I can say right now that his record of doing this climb, this is his 18th trip.
With the school.
With the school. And he had turned back 2 out of 3 times. So just to clear up that, this wasn't a march into the oblivion by this guy who was a respected teacher and leader at the school. Well, in any case, they continue up. They're at the Hog's Back, and maybe you can put the next slide on. And so right here, you see the actual Hog's Back. And then the exposed Crater Rock. They left their packs there right at the bottom of the Hog's Back. The couloir goes down to the left, and you can actually see the Palmer Lift right in the center of the picture. So Father Tom says, well, Ralph Summers says, well, let's we ought to turn back now. He said, well, let's just go on just a little bit more. And so they did that. And then it became apparent as the weather changed rapidly and became very severe, that it was time to turn back, which they did. And they got back down to their packs. And by this time, one of the students, Patrick McGinnis, was experiencing some hypothermia. So they stopped to rewarm him. The students huddled around him. Ralph Summers got out a stove. They cooked up some a brew of water and rewarmed him, and then continued down from there. By the time they get to the bottom of the couloir, the weather is severe, and the winds are 60 miles an hour. They can't find the wands. By the way, they had wanded all the way up from the bottom of the couloir, or from the top of really the Palmer lift, to the couloir. But it was hard to find the wands. And maybe now put on the next slide. So here we are above the Hog's Back. And this is more like what the conditions were on that day. I think Peter Lev took this picture because he climbed the mountain with Ralph Summers a couple of weeks later. And you can again see the Palmer lift at 11 o'clock in the picture. Then you can see the route down. So at this point, a compass was necessary, and they knew what the declination was. For some reason or another, when the compass came forward from the back of the line to Ralph Summers, it was 20 degrees offset. So that means that instead of going directly to the Palmer lift, they went over to the left. So if you can put on the next slide. So here is probably about halfway down. This is not from the actual climb itself, but you can see the Palmer lift over on the right. Timberline Lodge is down there in the trees. The area where they wound up bivouacking is over there on the left, about 10 o'clock or so. Only about 300 or 400 yards from the Palmer lift. But the compass deviation is what brought them over to the left. And when they went into a small crevasse, really maybe even just a break in the snow, it was now about 7 o'clock at night. And so Ralph said, we're going to have to dig in. And that's what they did. And they had one snow shovel, and they dug as best they could. They dug out a cave, 3 feet by 4 feet by 7 feet, something like that. And Ralph got out a space blanket and put that in as a floor and said, get your warm clothes out of your pack. We're not going to be able to have our packs in here with us. And so they spent the rest of that night rotating in and out of the cave, trying to keep things going in, meanwhile, fierce weather outside. Next morning, Ralph decides that he better go down and try to let people know what was going on. And he asked if anyone would like to come with him. Molly Shula said she would go with him, and they did that. And they continued.
Just wanted to say,
Yeah.
Molly was one of the other climbing team members.
Right, so
well.
she was an advanced leader.
Yeah.
So, so now you have give you some idea of the ratio of people. A reasonable ratio for a grade 1 climb. But they go way down the valley to the left and do get to another lodge. But meanwhile, the storm carries on for the next 2.5 days. And rescuers can't get to them and really do anything until the 3rd day, at which point they begin to find a terrible situation. They find 3 bodies out in the snow, curled in a fetal position and obviously dead. They don't actually find the cave until a day later, I think it was. Thank you for putting that back on. The snow cave, the 3 bodies are shown there, and the route that Ralph and Molly took out. So they're probing, the rescue groups, of which there were many, start to probe, and they finally hit a solid object, and they found the cave. And the short story is that 7 of the 9 people had died. 2 were alive, Brinton Clark and Giles Thompson. Their core temperatures in the 80s, and brought back to Portland and survived. One of the early interventions tried out was opening up a chest cavity and massaging and rewarming Giles' heart, which is an amazing thing for the time that Cameron Banks put forward. So that's how it all unfolded. What happened next, of course, was the aftermath and the investigation that we did, dealing with everybody back at the school. Our team interviewed all the students, we interviewed all the parents, all the teachers, and I will conclude by just saying briefly that our biggest fault finding, if you will, was that they didn't turn back sooner, given the conditions, and in fact, given their equipment. They really didn't have proper clothing for this severe a condition. They did for climbing Mount Hood, which is one of the most climbed peaks out west. It's about like Mount Washington back east, and also with a similar number of fatalities over the years, 130 to 150. But the not turning back, Father Tom Goldman said clearly that he wanted to be the one making the decisions. And we determined from what Ralph Summers and others told us, and this is speculation, but a very likely one given his previous track record, that he was suffering from hypothermia himself. He was not making good judgments, and his behavior became quite erratic.
Was not consistent with.
Not consistent with previous behaviors. And in the cave, he was reported to have been screaming and having tremendous difficulty. So, there was a lot of attempt at finger pointing and blame going around afterwards, and very unfortunate situation. The other 2 factors that come into it, and these are the similarities between Mount Hood and the shuttle Challenger. As those of you who have seen the accident matrix I've been fiddling around with for years, the 2 key things over in the errors in judgment are trying to stick to a schedule and trying to please other people. Now, this was the last possible weekend or attempt that they could make. This is attempt number 4. And a lot of
there were several groups that went every year. It wasn't all the sophomores all at once.
Right. So there was that factor, and then, it's the culture of the school and your teachers and your peers and so forth. And so you get wound into that a little bit. And I'm going to let Lorca pick up from here. I think you can just go back to us if you want. And then we'll ask some of the key questions at the end. But talk a little bit about maybe about what's next, what happened next.
Yeah. I'm not going to talk very much here about my experience of those 4 days, partly because for the first time this year, I told that whole story, and I did that as part of the TEDx Bozeman talk that I did. So if you can go and find that there. I do want to say that I was up on the mountain for a while waiting for something to happen and waiting for them to come down. And that got harder and harder, and the situation got bigger and noisier and more humans. There were ultimately, I believe, over 400 people involved in the rescue from all over the region, and some people that came in from other parts of the country. So it was an enormous proposition involving military, involving volunteer pilots and helicopters, and then all the people on the ground. Um, and the investigative team was called in relatively quickly, quite soon afterwards, and for me it was a huge relief, actually, because Jed and Peter Lev and my both belonged in the same, at the time, smaller mountaineering community that existed in the United States. And one of the hardest things for me early on was the large numbers of humans that had who didn't see why anyone would be on a mountain in the first place. And so this showed up as much worse for them, that there wasn't value in risks, that there wasn't value in wilderness and early gathering of those skills and those experiences. So having them arrive made a huge, it was just an anchor for me personally. And also, it was very hard for us to have the uncertainty and the length of time it took for the whole thing to unfold. When he said they brought everyone off the mountain, I mean, technically, everyone who did get brought off the mountain was not alive. They were all extremely cold. And so the ones who did survive were brought back. Cameron said that they learned more about hypothermia in that day than they learned in the previous 100 years. So scientifically speaking, it was an extraordinary experience for them. But immediately there were a few things that really, really mattered. And one of them was that we were lucky that we were an extraordinary place, that school was. It was small, it was intimate, and there were really good people there. And so there was instant support and instant connection and instant nest of love, even, and caring and responsiveness that we never were without. And we had a month to go before the end of school that year. And so we were all together for that, through all the funerals that happened one after another, and through the media that started to unfold, and then the investigations. And then I also really want to say we were intensely supported by our larger communities, by all the family and friends, and by the city of Portland. Reached out enormously, people from beyond Portland and from even all over the world. We would receive piles of letters from school children that said, "I'm sorry your friends died, and I wish it hadn't happened." And it all mattered. And then we started moving forward into looking at how we were going to be as a community who could hold all of that, right? All of the pain and all of the uncertainty and all of the love and all of the commitment, and be all of these things moving forward, having lost some of ourselves. So for me personally, it was an extraordinary experience in not only moving through a process from being a victim to a survivor to something beyond that eventually, but to watch hundreds of other humans do it as well. And to start to really pay attention to very carefully the things that really worked, right? The ways in which I could look at some people and say, that's their way of coping, but it's going to cost them down the road. Or that's a way of coping that's hurting other people. Or this is something that's this is a good skill to have through a lifetime that I want to keep feeding in myself, or teaching others. And so that's how my whole life has eventually unfolded into becoming extremely fluent in what it is to be resilient in the face of trauma or crisis or change or stress, or and what are the things that matter the most in not being one of the ones who's lost. Yeah.
Huge takeaway for me in this whole thing. And curiously enough, well, I knew about the support immediately afterwards because we were there. And then I went back out later that summer to deliver our report. And there the whole community was, and their openness, and to the extent of your first slide, which showed that the whole report was put in the newspaper. Other schools and programs had not done anything like that, I must say. And then, the one that we all know about with Willie Unsold and his students at Evergreen State College. Those students dispersed, that was right at the end of the school year. And those students dispersed and they didn't come back together again for 20 years after that event. There was no debriefing, no healing that took place other than what was spontaneous among themselves. So, just to preempt what some of the questions might be, I think this is, aside from the nitty-gritty details of what, how big, were they insulated boots? So never mind, this is the big stuff here.
Yeah.
And then should we be doing this kind of thing?
Standing here, I still say yes. It's deeply important, and to do it with the greatest amount of wisdom and training and understanding and practice. Obviously, all of those things, but a lot of the things that I'm on the faculty at the Montana State University right now, teaching in the leadership program, in resilient leadership, and these kids are wrestling with ways of being that are directly the result of being shielded from risk, being shielded from failure, and so now they're coming upon it, and in some cases crashing and burning because it's brand new. And so if there are ways in which we can consistently give our young people the experience of risk, the experience of failure without drastic consequences, this is something that all humans need badly, right? So, yeah.
Wow, this is amazing. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you two kind of pouring your hearts out and telling us about your experience here. And what's coming out is, you think about a report that's going to be written on an accident or an incident in climbing. Like you said, Jed, it's okay. What were they wearing? The proper equipment and da-da-da-da. But what I'm hearing is that the human factors involved in a tragedy like this, if you have a community that you're a part of as an organization or as an individual, that can be the difference between an incident like this being the end of a lot of people's worlds or being the beginning. And that's sort of beyond the report.
Yeah. Yeah, that feels fundamental. I have deep, close friendships today with my friends from then and with faculty from OES and with this guy.
He reached out to me about 5 or 6 years ago.
Again.
And
yeah.
I've been here once a year ever since, partly because I have some business out here. But anyway, it's been
Jed,
a blessing for me.
You've done a lot of these kind of investigations. I mean, do you have this huge group of close friends that you get from every single one of them, or is this a unique experience?
No, certainly from some of them, for sure. But, for the most part, I'm up at 20,000 feet. There have been very few of them that have been this close and personal on the ground kind of thing. And it was required in this case. Look at the number of people that were affected by the whole thing. Most of the time you're dealing with, with one fatality or one serious injury. And this is pretty unique. But, you know, the larger question is how do institutions, whether it's an educational program or outward bound or whatever kind of project it might be, how do you take stuff away from this?
Exactly. Well, we have our first question coming in from Brad. It says, I'd like to hear more about the similarities with the Challenger disaster. And also, are there any similarities to the Ptarmigan Peak tragedy in 1997?
Yeah.
There's a second part of the question. How do we, as those that take people into the mountains and train others for this work, recognize the traps of sticking to the schedule and trying to please people?
Right. Well, just quickly on the shuttle Challenger, there were also 5 investigators on that, but one of them was one of my favorite physicists, a guy named Richard Fineman, who he didn't write very much. He gave a lot of talks, and fortunately those were recorded and been made into books. One of them was called The Joy of Finding Things Out. But he broke from the team. He said, I want to go talk to a military guy down in Florida here and ask him some questions. So he goes down and does that. And he's talking to a retired colonel or general, whatever he was, who was under the hood of his Mercedes diesel. And they start talking about the Challenger. And this guy says, yep, I got the same problem with this engine here. Cold weather, those O-rings just don't work. But then Fineman went beyond that. I mean, that was the black and white answer once again, you know. He went beyond that. And he learned that this particular launch needed to happen that day as far as Washington was concerned. It was tied to some political events and some announcements that were going to be made. So there they were trying to stick to that schedule. And there were the scientists and those on the ground who knew about the O-rings trying to please other people. That is to say, Washington. So, and that can be found. Atlantic Monthly way back then did a big report on it, so you can check me out on that. And Ptarmigan Peak, of course, that was another huge incident with 12 students and 2 instructors in a couloir on Ptarmigan Peak. On descent, there were a party of 3, then a party of 4, which included a guide, then a party of 4, which included a guide, and then a party of 3. And they were diagonal across the couloir, plunge stepping down the thing. And middle person in the top rope slipped and fell. The other 2, because they didn't have the right techniques for burying their ice axes, couldn't hold them. So the 3 of them hit the next 4, those 7 hit the next 4, those 11 hit the next 3. 1,200 feet, 14 of them wind up at the bottom of the couloir. A couple fatalities, 11 helicopter rescues and so forth. That was huge because Anchorage is like a village too. And that hit that community big time. But I will tell you, the University of Alaska's approach to it was nothing like Oregon Episcopal School. The wonderful woman who came in just before this happened, Jed Williamson, well known to AEE, written a book called Lessons Learned, Volumes 1 and 2. She was actually told to change the report that she wrote. I mean, that to me is unconscionable. To say, well, we don't want to look bad here. So, and our report, I had Jim Ratz, who was at that time executive director of Knowles, and Darrell Miller, who was the South District Ranger in Denali Park, were the other 2 investigators. And we just didn't mince words on this thing. But that community didn't stay together. They were totally spread out after that. And the 2 instructors were, of course, devastated by it. They were Colorado Outward Bound instructors. One of them very experienced with snow and ice work, the other not so much so, but they made a decision at the end of the day that they've been beating themselves up over ever since.
Wow. We have another question coming in from Jory about sort of what happened at the Oregon Episcopal School after that incident. Did they continue offering the trip or something like it? Either way, how did those conversations happen to reach a conclusion of what to do with the program?
Yeah, the first thing they did was just put everything on hold. And that lasted for a long time,
2 years.
actually. Yeah, 2 years. So while they, first just started to put things back together again, and then had a long series of very involved conversations, both within the school and with experts outside the school, involving other schools that had programs as well. And they did reinstate an outdoor program, and it exists to this day. It doesn't include a climb of Mount Hood.
The first guy to go back and run the program was one of AEE's own, guy named Bill Proudman. AEE audience will recognize his name.
Yeah, our Kurt Hahn speaker from a couple years ago, I believe.
Yeah.
So, one theme that I keep hearing, Jed, is this schedule pressure and trying to please people is one of two of the number or the contributing factors to a lot of incidents like this. The decision to turn back or to decide that you're not going to make whatever your destination is. I'm sure that's, as mountaineers yourselves, that's probably something you've done personally, probably a number of times. Can you talk about making that decision? Because that's the moment, the crux moment for a lot of these guides that are involved in serious incidents. How can you help people make that decision when they need to make it?
Well, the first thing I'm going to bring up, of course, is Mount Everest, 1996 disaster, where two guides who were being paid a lot of money should have turned back with their clients and didn't, because their clients wanted to continue on. One client, it was his third go. And so, there's pressure, that kind of pressure right there. I mean, I've turned back a few times. In fact, I'm here today because
yeah, right. There's something that I'd like to just toss out there, which is some research that I found out about kind of accidentally. So when I did the TEDx Bozeman talk here in April, end of April, one of the other speakers was doing some really interesting research. He's another faculty member with me at Montana State University. And what he was doing he is an avalanche researcher, but they brought in a Swedish behavioral psychologist, and they were combining data on, they were giving trackers to climbers who are climbing, and then looking at this data, like when do they turn around and why, and what are the conditions when they do, and so they just looking at all this stuff. And it can be deeply important to do education on, for example, avalanche danger and reading it and reading conditions. And so they have had programs, in place to do all of that, but that wasn't actually, it turned out, being the decisive factor in turning around. That the decisive factor in a lot of these situations didn't have to do with the conditions or with the understanding and experience of the climbers, but with the behavioral dynamics, with the interpersonal dynamics of the groups. So that is really interesting, I think, direction to follow up on what's starting to show up in those kinds of where these two fields connect, because it's a wicked problem, right? It's never going to be just one or the other.
Sure. When you, in your work with resiliency, do you talk, when I think about resiliency, I think about pushing through, and sort of, being able to make it.
Yeah.
But how do you sort of contrast that with the work that you do?
I've redefined resilience. That for me, resilience is preemptive, right? It's how we give and feed everything to ourselves so that it doesn't matter what comes at us. that we have the energy, we have the focus, we have the calm and the strength to take what comes. And those are all nice things to have if you never run into a tragedy. But when you do, then for me, it's a fundamental responsibility to be the kind of human who can be with what is with respect. Yeah. So a lot of what I do is, when I do resilience work, is actually feeding the whole person so that they are not operating from a place of really low personal resources. Because that's where we lose. It doesn't matter how good you are, that's where we lose.
I'm going to have to take one of your seminars.
It's like Kurt Hahn would say about education being for the whole person, and not just for the brain.
Yeah, because that's where we live from, right? All of our decisions that we make are fundamentally coming from our whole person. So, yeah, so you have to be there.
Yeah.
There is one other factor that I'll talk about that I believe in completely, which is paying attention to your instincts. Now, instinct is not just something that comes out of the clouds. It comes with a whole lot of background of experience. And your built-in detector oftentimes will say, don't do this, or think about this, or yep, you can probably get this done. But if you just step back and do a little bit of reflection and instinct work, I don't know, what do you think of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, I mean, I think instinct is actually, I think, what we call the information we make as a whole person, right? So if we think like, what's my brain telling me, and what's my body telling me, and what is the information that I have coming in that I actually maybe am not even conscious of, right? Maybe on my way up, I noticed a couple of details, but not fully consciously, but they're in the mix when it comes to making a choice. So yes, I agree.
There is that perfect slope. Look at all that powder snow. Look at, there isn't a single track in that snow. It's not going to happen to me.
So trust your instincts. Don't get stuck to your schedule. Avoid trying to please people. Are there any, as we sort of wrap this up, are there any other closing thoughts or final messages you want to say to folks who are looking at this, or that you would want somebody who's running an outdoor program to consider as they're creating their program?
Build the kind of community first who can go through something hard. If you never need it, if you don't have anything hard happen, then fabulous, you have a great community, right? But I think it'd be very important for any organized venture that involves risk to really take a very hard look at what exists among us right now as resources for each other, right? And also, it has occurred to me since then that in some ways, we were very lucky that we were the organization we were. But if there had been any weak points after a trauma like that, or after a crisis, if there had been an existing something already that was shameful or bad or hard, our school, in the face of that kind of pressure, we would have imploded or exploded, right? So it's interesting to me that integrity actually is fundamental, not only in physics, but in communities, that we can add and support and stand from being a school or a community or an agency or a business that has integrity and as a fundamental value, because the stressors and cracks that exist in a good situation will change rapidly as soon as something happens.
Yeah, and what I would say is shared decision-making. One of the problems in hierarchical situations is that those who are oftentimes most affected have had no role in the decision-making process. And so, you know, I go back to, you know, that matrix thing of mine. And when I do that at workshops, I say, don't just keep this to yourself as an instructor. Hand it out to students and say, what's your role here in all of these factors? And what is your role in decision-making? Because you have to, as soon as you begin working with a group, is begin turning over decision-making to everybody.
Yeah, I would say as those of us who are on the climbing team, they were very clear with us about this, that we were to contribute in every way that we could see helpful. We were just, you know, help them go through their checklists for their packs, and we could, you know, correct someone's, you know, how they're carrying their ice axe, or we can do things like that. We were also told, like, this is not you're not responsible, right? We are going to be checking everything. So having very clear understandings, you know, so that we were involved, we could see things or notify the leaders that, hey, do you want to come check this too? Because I'm noticing this, and obviously that doesn't hold through the drain that comes with hypothermia. So, but it absolutely has to be there in the first place.
All right.
Well, thanks again. Thanks so much for helping us learn from your experiences with this tragic incident, and being open and helping us, at least helping me consider ideas like integrity and community as risk management resources in a way that I haven't before. I think that's really powerful stuff. We'll also make sure that folks have access to things like that TED Talk, Lorca, and your matrix, Jed. Like to put that out there whenever we can so people can get their eyes on it, along with this webinar when we get the recording and everything up. I do want to say I noticed a lot of folks who attended today are AEE members taking advantage of their new AEE member benefits and tuning in at no charge as a part of their membership. So we're excited to see people taking advantage of that. Make sure you visit the member resource library to see the over 30 other webinars that you'll have access to. And yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks once again, Jed and Lorca, for being here.
Thank you.